This is Kol Birama, the podcast of Congregation Ramat Raz 929 Tanakh Project. Join us each day as we study a chapter of Tanakh, building towards completing all 929 together. I'm Rabbi Yoni Zolti, and I'm glad you're here. Bereishit chapter 12. Chapter 12 marks a pivotal transition in the biblical narrative. The text shifts from the primordial universal stories of creation and early humanity to the particular genealogical account of one individual and his family. This movement from the cosmic to the intimate establishes the foundation for understanding how divine purpose manifests through specific historical actors rather than just abstract principles. What particularly distinguishes the Torah's portrayal of its protagonists is their psychological complexity and moral ambiguity. The patriarchs are not presented as hagiographic figures, but rather as multidimensional characters who embody both virtues and flaws, successes and failures. This literary sophistication becomes immediately apparent in our very first encounter with Avraham, where the narrative presents us with a morally ambiguous episode that has generated centuries of exegetical debate. Avraham receives the divine command to journey to the promised land, yet immediately upon his arrival, a severe famine compels him to abandon his destination. Instead, he flees to Egypt. This raises fundamental questions about obedience, providence, and human agency. Was Avram's departure a failure of faith, or rather a pragmatic response to existential crisis? The text, on the one hand, emphasizes the severity of the famine through linguistic intensification. Ki chaved hara'av ba'aretz, for the famine was severe. It was very severe. The doubling of terminology, both famine and severe, referencing the famine twice, suggests that Avram's departure may have been necessitated by circumstances beyond his control. On the other hand, having been directed by God to travel to the land of Israel, it's rather surprising that God then would intend for Avram to leave it so suddenly. More likely, as Ramban Nachmanides argues, the divine promise should have superseded material concern, and Avram should not have abandoned the land at the first sign of trouble. The narrative's moral complexity deepens when Avram requests that Sarah presents herself to the Egyptians as his sister rather than as his wife. This deception results in Sarah's appropriation by Pharaoh's court, and only divine intervention through plagues secures her release. The episode raises troubling questions about Avram's treatment of Sarah and his apparent material benefit from her predicament. The Hebrew text employs parallel linguistic structures that illuminate the moral ambiguity. Upon Avram's initial instruction to Sarah, he asks her, "Leman yitav li va'avurech v'chayita nafshi biglalech," so that it might go well with me because of you, and my life may be spared on your account. That same instruction, yitavli va'avurech, will do well for me, uses the same verbal root later to describe Avram's material enrichment. Ul Avram heitiv va'avura. And Avram was dealt well because of her. The lexical parallel suggests that Avram's quote-unquote good fortune was not merely incidental, but rather potentially even anticipated. The transformation of Avram's economic status proves equally significant. When he descends to Egypt, he descends as a famine refugee, but he returns as a man of substantial wealth. We're told he has tzon, uvakar, v'chamorim, v'avadim, ushfachot, v'atonot, ugmalim. He has a lot of livestock, and camels, and donkeys, and slaves, and maidservants, and mules. The text, in fact, employs the adjective kaved. He's so wealthy it's heavy, to describe Avram's newfound influence, which creates an almost ironic parallel with the kaved, this at the time severe famine that initially drove him from the land. He leaves the land of Israel because of a kaved famine, and he returns to Israel kaved with wealth. This linguistic connection suggests that Avram's material prosperity emerges directly from his moral compromise. Nachmanides offers perhaps the most severe interpretation of these events, arguing that in fact Avram's actions in Egypt constitute such a grave sin that it prefigures and causally explains the future Egyptian bondage of his descendants. According to his reading, the parallel between Avram's experience and the later Israelite slavery represents a divine retribution operating across generations. However, there are alternative explanations that suggest perhaps mitigating factors. A careful reading reveals that Avram's initial concern was focused on the general Egyptian population rather than on Paro specifically. When Avram originally instructed Sarah, he explicitly framed it in terms of the common Egyptians. "Hinena yadati ki isha yafat mar'at, v'haya ki yiru otach hamitzrim." Behold, I know that you are a pretty woman, and when it comes that the Egyptians, the common Egyptians, see you. His plan appears calibrated for encounters with the general populace. And when the narrative unfolds, we observe that there is a two-stage process that at first conforms with his plan, but then deviates from it. At first, just as he anticipated, Vayiru ota Mitzrim, the common Egyptians see her, confirming Avram's prediction about the common people's reaction. However, the text then reintroduces and begins anew with an rather unexpected second phrase, Vayiru ota sarei Pharaoh. Additionally to the common people seeing Sarah, now we're told that Paro's officers saw her as well, which leads her to be taken to Beit Paro, to Paro's house. This progression perhaps suggests that Avram's deception might have succeeded had it remained at the popular level, but it only failed when it attracted royal attention, an outcome that Avram may not have anticipated or planned for. Beyond these textual considerations, another potentially mitigating factor emerges when we examine the broader narrative pattern established by the episode. Perhaps most remarkably, the narrative of Avram's Egyptian sojourn contains striking typological parallels to the later Israelite experience. Just to list a couple of them, and there are really a lot of parallels, both stories feature a descent to Egypt, which is initially caused or precipitated by a famine. Avram descends because of a famine. Yosef and later Yaakov and his children descend to Egypt because of a famine. In both instances, there's a threat to male survival while the females are preserved, where here Avram is threatened and Sarai is going to protect him. In the later Exodus narrative, Paro's decree specifically targets male infants while sparing girls. In both stories, there are divine plagues which afflict Paro and his household. And Paro, as a result, makes an urgent request for departure, using the imperative kach valech, take and go, rushing them out after the divine afflictions. In both stories, they leave with great wealth. As they journey from Egypt to Israel, they journey in stages, in masaot, a strange additional detail that only appears here and in the Exodus story and nowhere else in the Bible. This parallel vocabulary and structure cannot be coincidental. The text appears to establish Avram's experience as a preconfiguration of his descendants' fate, creating what the Ramban terms throughout his commentary on the book of Bereishit, Maseh Avot Siman Labanim. The deeds of the fathers are a sign for the children. While the Ramban interprets that these parallels are evidence of transgression and retribution, an alternative reading suggests a different theological principle at work. The captivity in and redemption from Egypt may be perceived as a necessary introduction to the inheritance of the promised land, as foreshadowed in the Brit Ben Abtarim, the covenant between the pieces. Avram's detour to Egypt functions as an introduction to his ultimate inheritance of the land through a process of disengagement and re-engagement. This disengagement nullifies any sense of natural possession or political entitlement. The land of Israel is unique in biblical thought. It doesn't belong to its inhabitants, but it belongs to God. And God only grants inheritance to those who are morally deserving. In biblical philosophy, famine serves, rather, as an indication that the current population forfeited their right to inhabit the land. Both Abraham and later Yaakov's family must leave the land of Israel temporarily in order to receive the privilege of returning and later inheriting it. This paradox of possession, that one must first lose the land to truly receive the land later, reflects a deeper theological truth about the nature of divine blessing. Avram receives the promise of vast territorial inheritance only after his descent, because the very privilege of inheritance can only be granted after he disconnects and only later reconnects with the land. Neither territorial inheritance nor progeny is granted freely. Both are inextricably contingent upon the moral character of the nation that Avram will establish. For Avram as well, this very separation from the barren land, as well as his barren wife, constitute a necessary precondition for God's promise of fruitfulness. Both land and offspring will eventually be restored to him with divinely bestowed fertility, but only after he first demonstrates that his relationship to these blessings transcends mere material possession. This theological framework transforms Avram's apparent moral failure into a necessary stage in his spiritual development, suggesting that true inheritance requires that humility that comes only through exile and divine restoration. Thank you for joining today's learning. See you tomorrow for the next chapter of Tanakh.